Snow clung to the pines like secrets whispered in sleep. Morning light filtered weakly through the canopy, casting long, pale shadows over the land. Caleb stood at the edge of his property. A flannel jacket tugged tight against the bite of mountain wind, eyes tracing the ridgeline as if searching for something that refused to show itself. Since the snow had sealed off the town, the mountains had grown quieter, more sacred in a way. The usual rhythm of work paused beneath the frost. Tools hung idle. The rivers slowed. But within the stillness, tension persisted like the space between an inhale and the word that follows it. Inside the cabin, Evelyn carefully stirred a kettle above the hearth, her hands steady despite the fatigue in her shoulders. Miriam, ever watchful, stitched a torn scarf while Clara paced near the window, muttering about being trapped with 3 horses, no biscuits, and a man who communicates in grunts. Despite the claustrophobia, despite the fear they all refused to speak aloud, the quiet had begun to feel like something redemptive. Some nights, Caleb spoke of the war, not in full but in pieces, of awful choices made in mud and smoke, of names forgotten but never forgiven. Evelyn never interrupted. Her silence was not absence, it was sanctuary. And when the fire receded each night into embers, they'd sit side by side in the hush, closer than distance allowed, hands sometimes brushing, hearts steadying like horses that had been spooked too often. It wasn't love-a-knot yet, but it was something more fragile, maybe more holy. An understanding. Outside, the hush of snow softened the world, but inside, a different quiet bloomed. The kind not born of fear, but of healing, of hope. And in the stillness of whispering pines, they began to believe that peace might just be worth the fight. The stagecoach rattled in on iron wheels just as the sun tipped low behind the mountains, casting whispering pines in hues of gold and rust. A wind stirred down from the east, colder than it should have been for early autumn biting, unfamiliar and sharp with the scent of distant rain. Folks paused in their conversations and chores as the coach rolled to a halt outside Mallory's general store, a cloud of red dust curling up around its wheels like rising smoke. Caleb leaned against the hitch post across the street, arms folded, shadow stretching long at his boots. He wasn't waiting for the stage, he never did, but he noticed it like one notices an animal that doesn't quite belong in the forest. Too polished, too deliberate. Evelyn Archer stepped out first. She wore traveling leathers dusty from the road and a black veil tucked back behind her hat. Her eyes scanned the town square with quick precision, neither fear nor awe in her gaze, just calculation. Behind her came Clara, younger but sharper in movement, dropping down from the coach with a sass that disguised steel. Miriam followed last, soft-spoken and silent, glancing once at the church as if arcing her place. Their presence stalled conversation. Caleb saw townsfolk turn away, whisper, or stare too long. Evelyn straightened her spine. The wind tugged at her coat. No one stepped forward until Caleb did. He didn't say much, just nodded and touched his brim, eyes on Evelyn. She returned a cautious half-smile. "Seems the wind's changed," the liveryman muttered nearby. Caleb didn't answer, but he knew something important had arrived on that eastbound stage, something more than land claims or old debts. A reckoning, perhaps, or something he'd long thought he'd buried, rising again, not through gunfire, but through the quiet insistence of a woman's unwavering eyes. Whispering Pines was about to remember how quickly a storm could start. The snow had fallen thick and slow overnight, cloaking Caleb's ranch in silence so complete it made every sound afterward feel sacred. Firelight glowed faintly through split-log walls, haloing Evelyn's profile as she stoked the hearth with a steady hand and faraway eyes. For once, her hands weren't trembling not from cold, nor fear, nor stubbornness, just stillness, the kind that comes when you realize everything might change tomorrow. Behind her, Caleb moved with quiet deliberation, checking rifle cartridges and looping leather reins with oil-blackened fingers. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The night had been long enough for words to sink deep between them. Words spoken by flame, by memory, by truth too heavy to bear alone. A floorboard creaked. Miriam appeared, wrapped in wool, rifle cradled. She nodded once at Caleb, then kissed Evelyn's forehead like a benediction. Outside, the wind dragged smoke in lazy spirals skyward, smearing the stars. Clara stood on the porch, face flushed beneath the rising light. She held an axe loosely in one hand, not for chopping wood this time. Tension hummed through the timber bones of the cabin. But beneath it, embers. Beneath every glance passed between them, beneath every slow breath and full silence, there was heat waiting to reignite. They had all come to this place broken in different ways by war, by grief, by a world that asked too much of women and demanded silence from men. But from ruin, they'd forged something sturdier. When hoofbeats echoed down through the pass, it wasn't fear that stirred first. It was resolve. "Whatever happens," Evelyn said quietly, meeting Caleb's eyes across the room, "we don't go backward." He touched the brim of his hat and answered just as soft, "Not even to bury the past." And as dawn bled over snow, the fire inside them began to rise. The wind hissed through the pine grove like it carried secrets, threading itself through every crack in Caleb's weathered homestead. Snow rimmed the edges of the barn roof, and pale morning light broke softly on the horizon, but Caleb had already been awake for hours. He moved with quiet exactness feeding Shadow, checking the corral posts, brushing flakes of frost from the worn saddles. It wasn't restlessness, it was ritual, discipline, the only thing that kept silence from becoming loneliness. He paused near the front gate, where the boards were splintered shattered in the night when Silas's men had hammered a creek-soaked notice onto the post with the dull end of a rifle. The paper, now frozen and torn, clung to the gate's shards. Caleb pulled it free, read it once more. "Vacate your premises by end of week. Final notice." His fingers tightened around it, but he folded it carefully, as if disrespecting it wouldn't change its intent. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Evelyn stepped out slowly, Clara behind her. The cold snatched at the hem of her wool cloak, but her eyes were clear, chin lifted. "They did this last night?" she asked, nodding at the twisted wood. Caleb didn't look at her at first. "Didn't want to wake anyone," he muttered. "You think that's kindness," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "But it's not bravery to bear things alone." He met her gaze, finally steady, but tired. "Some things a man carries so others don't have to." She drew a slow breath, glancing at the broken gate. Then she whispered, "We didn't come to be saved, Caleb." "I know," he said, and they stood there in silence, not as savior and saved, but as equals, beneath those whispering pines. Far in the hills, a lonely crow cried a sound that didn't feel like warning, but reminder. The storm hadn't ended. It had only paused. The sawmill creaked like an old confession, its boards swollen with damp mountain air and memory. Snow fell in long, whispery ribbons through the broken slats in the roof, pale light catching the dust motes as if time itself hung suspended. Caleb had been here too many times before not for shelter, but for solitude, and tonight it offered neither. He stepped silently, boots muffled in the hay-drifted floor. Shadow, his stallion, waited tethered outside, ears flicking at the silence. Caleb wasn't alone. He could sense it, felt it in the shift of air, the breath stilled beyond the stacks of lumber warped by weather and years. Evelyn pressed against a beam in the far corner, her pistol drawn, both hands steady. Her eyes didn't flinch when they met his. "You shouldn't have come," she said, each word shaped by tempered steel and snow-bitten breath. Caleb raised one gloved hand. "Neither should you. Silas's men burned our granary. Clara thinks they stashed supplies. Hare tried to hide them under town annals." He nodded. Of course. Smugglers didn't care who starved so long as they profited. Behind a stack of oak planks, a boot scraped. Caleb moved on instinct, pulling Evelyn down just as gunfire cracked the night's stillness. Bullets shattered timber behind them. The sawmill groaned like a giant waking. Together, they sidled through darkness, flanking the gunmen. Evelyn's silence in the moment was its own kind of Vauno panic, only purpose. Caleb rounded the last beam and found Red Jasper's youngest, Levi, his rifle show, aching in sweat-slick hands. "We're not the enemy," Caleb said lowly. "You're stealing from your own town come spring." Levi looked at them both, eyes glassy. Then he dropped the rifle and ran into the snow. Evelyn exhaled. "Justice doesn't feel clean." Caleb met her gaze. "It's never clean, it's just necessary." Outside, the pine forest whispered again. But tonight, its voice sounded less like warning and more like witness. The wind had the scent of ash that night. The soft hush of falling snow belied what lay beneath scorched earth, splintered door frames, and the lingering echo of Miriam's prayers whispered feverishly as smoke curled from the remnants of her home. Caleb stood at the edge of the ruins, Shadow snorting beside him, the stallion's ears twitching at every distant snap of twig. "They did this," Evelyn said, voice trembling, not from fear but fury. "They sent a message." Caleb nodded once, slow and solemn. "Now we send one back by surviving." By day's end, he'd cleared his bunkhouse and brought the women to his ranch. Evelyn resisted, of course, glaring, arms crossed like a general embattled. But even she knew the snow would close the pass by nightfall, fences mended, hay stacked, and the last root cellar double-barred. The ranch became a fortress in the timbered silence. But silence didn't last. It began with hoofbeats in the ravine too rhythmic for wild animals. Then came cut fences, missing supplies, and the eerie silence of birds driven from trees. Caleb made rounds every dawn, shotgun slung beneath his coat, never speaking of what he saw blood on a fence post, a dead raven nailed beside an old saddle bone. Clara caught him once burning a marked scrap of paper beside the woodpile. He didn't explain. And Evelyn began to watch him differently. One night, as he limped inside from a frozen patrol, she stopped him at the door. "They're not just circling," she said. "They're waiting for us to fall." He met her gaze for a long moment, then gently, "Then we don't fall, we hold, like stone, like pine." Beyond the window, the wolves didn't howl. They watched. Snow muffled everything except the sound of Caleb's boots crunching over the frozen earth. Each step left an impression on the untouched drifts, a quiet declaration that someone still stood watch in the cold. The trees loomed around him, great pines heavy with snow, and each passing gust made them sigh like old sentinels tired of holding secrets. Caleb paused at the split-rail fence near the pasture. Shadow stood alert beneath the lone birch, steam curling from his nostrils. Caleb urged a soft whistle, the one only that horse ever truly responded to. Shadow's ears flicked and he trotted over, bumping his nose against Caleb's chest. There was comfort in the ritual, the steady thump of hooves, the feel of warm breath in an otherwise silent world. Behind him, the cabin stood stout under its snow-laden roof, light flickering from the lower windows. From up inside, the loft, where Miriam had taken watch, he could sense her outline settling in rifle close, eyes sharper than most men's. Inside, Clara was peeling potatoes with a knife a bit too sharp for the task, muttering at the unfairness of it all. And Evelyn pictured her where he left her, brushing down the saddle blanket and whispering to that skittish colt they'd saved from the frozen creek. He hadn't told her yet, but he would soon. That this kind of stillness, this quiet gathered between storms, was rare and sacred to him. It let a man listen beyond his own shame, feel a peace that needn't be earned through blood. The wind shifted. Another set of tracks, slow and light, approached from the woods. He turned, hand resting lightly on the revolver under his coat. This silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. The fire crackled low in the hearth, its amber glow reflecting in Evelyn's eyes as she sat curled near the warmth beneath a heavy quilt. Outside, the snow whispered against the windows, a hush of the storm still lingering in the deep of night. Caleb sat across from her, one hand absently stroking the faded leather of his saddle holster, eyes distant but steady. Neither had spoken in a while. In this quiet, unmeasured time, words felt heavier, more like choices than conversation. "You left the army," Evelyn finally said, her voice barely breaking the stillness. Caleb nodded once, slowly. "Deserved nothing less than to walk away from it," he replied. "We rode in thinking we were bringing justice. The intel was wrong. Just a camp of farmers, families, a different flag on their tents, and that was all it took for command to send us in." His jaw tensed. He wouldn't meet her gaze. "Were you the one who gave the order?" she asked, not accusing, but needing truth. "Didn't have to," he murmured. "Boys trusted me. So when I moved forward, they followed." The logs popped, and for a moment, it was only the fire speaking. Evelyn's fingers tightened over the quilt. "My father died clutching papers nobody read. Claimed that patch of land was free. Fought for it like it was all he'd ever owned. Put pride before sense." She looked across the flames. "I hated that about him, but I understand it now. The ache. Not the anger, but how hard peace is when everything inside you still hears marching drums." They sat in that vulnerable silence, two soldiers from different battles, bound by the same grief. After a long breath, Evelyn whispered, "Why help me?" Caleb raised his eyes. "Because when the land is at war with men, and men at war with women, someone ought to just choose peace." Evelyn reached forward calloused hands threading his. And in that moment, neither of them was alone. Caleb stood beneath the skeletal trees, their branches feathered with frost, holding Shadow's reins loosely in one hand. Across the firelit clearing, Evelyn coiled a strip of cloth around Miriam's burned wrist. Snow drifted sideways, flecks catching in her hair. For a moment, he just watched her, the way sorrow softened her features, yet never stole her strength. He turned away, jaw tight. That look of quiet endurance, it mirrored too closely faces he'd seen during the war, faces he couldn't save. Later, with the wind howling against the eaves, Evelyn found him oiling his rifle alone in the barn. She walked in without a word, arms around herself. Finally, in the heavy hush, she asked, "Why do you risk so much for us?" He looked up. "Because I gave my word once that land and law would mean something, then help destroy both. If I can keep one promise now, maybe it'll mean I didn't ride away for nothing." She hesitated. "Is that all this is? Redemption?" He closed the rifle's chamber with a click. "No, it's because when you stood at the gate with fire in your eyes and refused to kneel to a man like Silas, I remembered why I fought. It wasn't for orders. It was for the stubborn hope that something better could take root." Evelyn reached up, brushed a finger along the scar above his brow. "Then promise me this. You won't run when the storm crests." "I won't," Caleb said. "Not this time." Hands brushed. A fraction more, and it became something else, confession without words. Overhead, hooves thundered across frozen ground. A nail tore through timber outside the sound of a final warning affixed to Caleb's gate. He looked toward the door. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Let them come," she whispered, "but we stand." The cold air hung thick with frost as the horizon began to burn with pale orange thread, sowing light through the thinning mist. Caleb stood at the edge of his porch, coat open despite the chill, breath barely moving. Beside him, Sheriff Griggs loaded the last round into his shotgun with trembling hands, not from fear but exhaustion. This was the end of too many silent compromises. The snow crunched under boots. Evelyn stepped forward, hair braided against the wind, gaze steady. Clara tightened her shawl and stood just behind her, while Miriam ascended into the attic, cradling her late husband's rifle like a prayer. They had no illusions. This wasn't a fair fight, but neither was life not until someone made it so. Silas arrived, flanked by his men, cruel smiles cutting through stubbled jaws. Red Jasper, gun already low on his hip, scanned for weakness. He didn't see Caleb, saw a ghost from wars now distant, and ghosts don't scare men like Jasper. "You got no right," Silas called out, voice coiling. "This land's not yours to take," Caleb replied quietly. The world stilled. "I won't ask again," Silas warned. "You won't get the chance." Jasper's hand twitched. Caleb moved like a storm, remembered clean, sudden. One shot echoed across the silence. Jasper hit the snow, crimson blooming around his chest like a wildflower out of season. Silas didn't speak again. His voice had left with the thunder. Townsfolk began to appear, not as soldiers, but shadowsmen and women with shovels, hammers, hunting rifles. One placed a steady hand on Evelyn's shoulder. Sheriff Griggs crossed the frost to Silas, lifted the mayor's badge from his wool. "You're finished." The sky brightened. Caleb looked to Evelyn. Her hand found his not as possession but promise. And in that breath the land exhaled. Dawn broke cold and low, frost clinging to the porch railings like brittle lace. Silence filled Caleb's ranch, but for the stirring of snow beneath boots and the creak of saddles settling with weight, the world felt suspended still enough to hear a rifle's breath, tense enough for the wind itself to hesitate. Caleb stood on bare earth, snow flattened beneath his boots, eyes locked on the rise where Silas and his men approached. 6 riders, Red Jasper at the front, Silas astride just behind, flanked by war-faced men with cold iron on their hips. No pretense of diplomacy, no deputy vouches, just snow and steel. Behind Caleb, the porch creaked as Evelyn stepped to his side, her expression steady, shadowed by morning light. Clara stood further back, hands hidden by her shawl, jaw clenched tight. Overhead, behind the cabin window, the glint of Miriam's rifle caught brief sun, and from the woods and brush, from behind wagons and fence lines, the townfolk emerged, slowly, quietly, unified. "You've had your warning, Rhodes," Silas called out, voice carrying more venom than courage. "You stand with squatters, bandits, and women who think grief gives them grit. Step aside." Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. "A man who threatens women in the dead of night doesn't get to lecture on honor." "You siding with them?" Red Jasper spat into the snow. "Last chance." The moment cracked. Jasper's hand twitched toward his gun. Caleb already moved. One shot. Sharp and fast. Jasper sprawled beside his horse before his weapon cleared leather. Guns began to rise, but the mood fractured. Griggs stepped forward, his shotgun leveled, then townsfolk, one by one, followed suit. Silas spun, expecting loyalty, found none. In silence, Sheriff Griggs reached over, pulled the tin badge from Silas's coat. "You won't be taking anything else from this town." And just like that, winter stood still. Justice, at last, had a name. The snow had melted into the veins of the valley, soaking the ground with the truth of what survived. Morning light sifted through the pine trees, dappling the dark, rich earth where wildflowers dared their first bloom in months. On land scorched by conflict and blanketed by silence, new roots took hold. Evelyn stood knee-deep in the loam, her skirts gathered above her boots, steadying a young apple sapling as Caleb shoveled in soil, their hands metaxidentally, then deliberately pressing dirt around the fragile trunk. He looked up, eyes crinkled from sun and something softer. She smiled without words, brushing wind-blown hair from her face. Nearby, Miriam directed a group of young girls repairing a fence post. She worked with sleeves rolled and her rifle balanced within reach, not out of fear, but habit. Behind her, the outline of her new schoolhouse took form, roof scaffolded, windows open to promise. Clara passed on horseback, tossing a packet of newsprint toward the main road, her name now gracing the masthead of the Whispering Ledger. Caleb's ranch had merged with Evelyn's homestead quietly, a line in the dirt, not marked by deeds or declarations, but by shared labor and morning bread. They didn't speak of what came before, not in fear or denial, but in reverence for peace hard won. When Sheriff Griggs stopped by with his badge tucked in a worn saddlebag, he declined coffee just to watch Evelyn mediate a quarry dispute between two brothers. He tipped his hat as he left. "Justice rides better without my old bones in the saddle." That night, as wind murmured through the pines once more, Evelyn and Caleb sat on the porch, boots against worn railing, mugs cupped in hand. The land was quiet, not with absence, but with choice. And that, they knew, was the beginning of something worth planting. The gavel Evelyn held wasn't heavy, but its weight pressed deep into her palm. It was symbolic, nothing official about it beyond the circle of chairs within the old schoolhouse, now repurposed as the town's courthouse. She stood at the center, the morning light from the high windows cutting gold across the floorboards. Around her sat miners, mothers, merchants, ordinary folks who had, for the first time, chosen by consensus to install justice not from a man's fist, but from a woman's steadied voice. Evelyn's new title, Justice of the Peace, was scribbled on a page tacked to the town board. But she knew it was more than clerical ink. It meant change. It meant risk. And it meant responsibility she'd never asked for, only earned. Caleb watched from the back of the room, arms folded, eyes steady, fighting both pride and protectiveness. This was her stand now. His work, for the moment, was quieter, rebuilding fences, reseeding fields, letting the earth know it was safe again. The first case brought before her was a ranch hand caught trespassing for would a minor charge, but a harsh sentence meant to intimidate under the old mayor's rule. Evelyn leaned forward, listening not just to words, but to weariness in tone, weathering in hands. When she spoke, her ruling was decisive but lenient. A fine waived in trade for work on the schoolhouse roof. Mercy exchanged like coin. Behind her, Miriam stood quietly, a silent sentinel with rifle slung across her shoulder, and Clara jotted every word for the town paper. The start of record-keeping by truth, not threat. When court adjourned, no one clapped, but no one looked away either. They lingered not in fear, but in respect. Later, as snow melted under the first blush of spring, a new sign was nailed beside the old post office door. Justice, Archer, office hours by sunlight reason. The first streaks of pale gold cracked through the canyon ridge, filtering between the pines like whispers of warmth. Lo, none withheld. The snow had begun to melt during the past 2 days, not quite surrendering but loosening its grip on the land. A hush lingered over the valley, not of fear or silence, but of relief, of breath held during winter and now exhaled through the thaw. Caleb cinched the final strap on Shadow's saddle, smooth and practiced, yet interrupted by a glance over his shoulder. Evelyn stood beside her own mare, her hands moving with calm certainty. She wore a long indigo coat, her hair tied back but loose at the edges, wind-teased. It was not the clothes that marked a shift, but the ease in her posture, the way she met Caleb's gaze and held it, as though they'd traveled far in fewer steps than either expected. "Still think we're riding the same direction?" she asked, half grin hinting at mischief, though her voice remained soft. He nodded once, eyes catching quiet amazement in her face. "If we weren't, I'd ask to change my trail." She said nothing, only mounted, a swift, fluid motion. They rode without hurry, twin silhouettes against the rising light, hooves crunching the frost-pocked path that would eventually lead back to town and forward toward whatever tomorrow offered. Trees bowed slightly overhead, and a hawk traced silent spirals in the sky. After some time, Evelyn broke the silence. "Do you think peace ever stays?" "No," Caleb replied, "but I think people can." She looked over steady, not surprised. "Then we'll have to remind it when it wanders." He touched the brim of his hat in response, and they kept riding, not away from danger, but towards something worth tending. The pines whispered again, and this time the land listened.